Rosalind Vance had packed her life into a single carpet bag twice before. The first time, she was young, standing at the gates of a workhouse in Plymouth, with nothing but a change of stockings and her mother's brass thimble. The second time, she was 19, leaving a cruel household in Cornwall where the mistress had slapped her for spilling candle wax on a tablecloth. This third time hurt worse than both of those combined. She pulled the drawstring tight and looked around the tiny attic room she had called home for the past 11 months. A narrow iron bed, a wooden stool, a cracked mirror on the wall that caught the first gray light creeping through the dormer window. The room was cold, as it always was in early spring, and her breath came out in thin white clouds. Downstairs, the great house of Oakhaven Manor slept in perfect silence. The kitchen fires had not yet been lit. The footmen had not yet drawn back the curtains in the grand parlor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, would not ring the servants' bell for another hour at least. By then, Rosalind planned to be gone. She set the carpet bag on the bed and opened the top drawer of her small dresser. Inside lay her discharge letter, the one she had written herself, since the Duke had refused to give her one. She had worded it carefully, stating her months of service and her good conduct, and signed it with her own name. It would have to do. No respectable household in England would hire a maid without a letter of character from her previous employer, and the Duke of Oakhaven had made it perfectly clear that he would never provide one, because he did not want her to leave. And that, Rosalind thought bitterly, was the cruelest part of all. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket and fastened the single brass button at her throat. Her reflection stared back at her from the cracked mirror. A young woman of 22, with dark hair pinned tightly beneath a plain bonnet, tired eyes, and a jaw set hard against the trembling of her chin. She would not cry. She had promised herself that much. The memory of last evening pressed against her chest like a stone. The entire household had been summoned to the great hall after supper. Every footman, every kitchen girl, every groom and gardener had stood in rows along the oak-paneled walls, while Christopher Sterling, the 5th Duke of Oakhaven, stood at the head of the long table in his finest evening coat and announced his engagement to Lady Genevieve Thorne of Somerset. His voice had been steady and formal. His expression had been unreadable. He had not looked at Rosalind once during the entire speech, and that single fact told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had passed between them over these 11 months, the late conversations in the library when she brought his evening tea, the quiet walks through the East Garden when she was hanging linen and he appeared with a book in his hand and no reason to be there, the afternoon 3 weeks ago when his fingers had brushed hers as she handed him a letter and neither of them had pulled away, all of it meant nothing. He was marrying another woman, and Rosalind Vance was still just a housemaid. She picked up the carpet bag, blew out the candle on the dresser, and stepped into the narrow servants' corridor. Her boots made no sound on the bare wooden floor. She had learned long ago how to walk through a grand house without being heard. Down the back staircase, past the still dark kitchen, through the scullery, and out the side door into the cold morning air. The sky above Oakhaven was the color of slate, and a fine mist hung low over the gravel drive. Rosalind pulled her coat tighter and walked quickly toward the gatehouse. Beyond the estate walls, the village road led to the coaching station at Dorset Cross, where the early stagecoach to Plymouth departed at 6:30. She had enough coins for a one-way fare, and perhaps 2 nights at a boarding house. After that, she would need to find work immediately. The thought frightened her, and she walked faster to outrun it. The coaching station was a modest stone building, with a wooden bench out front and a hand-painted sign that read, Dorset Cross, coaches to Plymouth, Exeter, and London. A few early travelers were already gathered beneath the awning, stamping their feet against the cold. An elderly clergyman, a farmer's wife with a basket of eggs, a young clerk, clutching a leather satchel. Rosalind bought her ticket from the station master, a round-faced man named Mr. Briggs, who recognized her from the estate. "Leaving Oakhaven, are you, miss?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Family matters in Plymouth," Rosalind lied, and took her ticket without meeting his eyes. She sat on the wooden bench and set the carpetbag on her lap. The stagecoach would arrive in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, and she would be free of Christopher Sterling and his fine house, and his engagement to a woman whose name Rosalind could barely bring herself to say aloud. She closed her eyes and breathed. 15 minutes passed. Then she heard the hooves. A single horse, moving fast along the village road. The sharp, rhythmic strike of iron shoes on packed earth, growing louder with every second. Rosalind opened her eyes and turned toward the sound, just as a tall bay gelding rounded the bend at full gallop and came to a hard stop in front of the coaching station, sending gravel spraying across the yard. Christopher Sterling swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He was wearing riding boots, a half-buttoned waistcoat, and no cravat. His dark hair was uncombed, and his breath was ragged, as though he had ridden the 2 miles from Oakhaven at a dead run. He looked like a man who had dressed in 30 seconds and left the house on fire. His eyes found Rosalind immediately. "You are not boarding that coach," he said. Rosalind stood up from the bench, gripping her carpetbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You have no right to tell me where I may or may not go, Your Grace. I have every right. You are employed at Oakhaven Manor, and you have not been formally discharged. Then discharge me, right now. Give me my papers and my back wages, and I will be on the Plymouth coach within the quarter hour." Christopher stared at her for a long, hard moment. Then he turned to the station master, who was watching the entire scene from behind his ticket window, with his mouth slightly open. "Mr. Briggs," Christopher said, "I would like to purchase every remaining seat on the 6:30 coach to Plymouth." Mr. Briggs blinked. "Every seat, Your Grace?" "Every seat. And every seat on the 7:15 to Exeter, while you are at it." He reached into his coat and laid a small leather purse on the counter. Mr. Briggs opened it, counted the coins inside, and looked up with wide eyes. "That will cover both coaches and then some, Your Grace." "Excellent." Christopher turned back to Rosalind. "Your ticket has been revoked. There are no available seats on any departing coach this morning. I suggest you return with me to the estate, where we can discuss this matter properly." Rosalind felt her face flush hot, despite the cold morning air. The other passengers were staring. The clergyman was pretending to read his prayer book. The farmer's wife was not even pretending. "You cannot simply buy an entire stagecoach to stop me from leaving," Rosalind said through her teeth. "I just did. This is madness." "Perhaps?" Christopher stepped closer and lowered his voice so that only she could hear. "But if you leave Oakhaven today, Rosalind, you will be in danger that I cannot explain to you here. And I will not allow that. I will buy every coach in Dorset if I must." The intensity in his voice stopped her cold. This was not the controlled, composed Duke who had stood in the great hall last evening and announced his engagement with the calm precision of a man reading a shipping manifest. This was something raw, something urgent, something almost desperate. Rosalind searched his face for any sign of deception and found only exhaustion and fear. "What kind of danger?" she whispered. "The kind I cannot speak of in a public coaching yard." He held out his hand. "Come back to the house, please. I will explain everything I am able to." The stagecoach to Plymouth rounded the bend in the road, its 4 horses steaming in the morning air. It pulled into the station, and the driver called for passengers. Nobody moved. Every seat had been bought. Rosalind looked at the coach. She looked at Christopher's outstretched hand. She looked at the road stretching south toward Plymouth, and a life she could begin fresh, without the ache of loving a man who belonged to someone else. Then she picked up her carpetbag and walked past his hand toward his horse. I will ride back with you, she said quietly. But if your explanation does not satisfy me, Your Grace, I will walk to Plymouth on foot if I have to. Christopher nodded once and helped her onto the saddle. They rode back toward Oakhaven in silence, and the mist closed around them like a curtain drawn shut. The north wing of Oakhaven Manor had been closed since the old Duke's death 2 years prior. Dust sheets covered the furniture in most of the rooms, and the curtains had been drawn so long that the fabric had begun to fade in pale stripes where the sunlight crept through the gaps. It smelled of old paper and cold stone, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender left too long in a drawer. Christopher led Rosalind past the shrouded parlor and the empty guest chambers to a room at the very end of the corridor. He unlocked the door with a key from his waistcoat pocket and stepped aside to let her enter. It was a library, a proper one, with floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound volumes and a heavy oak writing desk positioned beneath a tall window that overlooked the rear gardens. A fire had already been laid in the grate, which meant Christopher had sent word ahead before riding to the coaching station. He had planned this. Rosalind set her carpet bag on the floor and turned to face him. You said you would explain. I did. Christopher closed the door behind them and crossed to the desk. From the top drawer, he withdrew a leather portfolio tied with a dark ribbon. He placed it on the desk between them, but kept one hand flat on top of it. Before I say anything further, I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you is bound by a legal agreement. There are certain details I am forbidden to share, and if I break that agreement, I lose this estate and everything attached to it. Then why bring me here at all? Because you were about to walk out of the one place where I can actually keep you safe, and I would rather risk a lawsuit than watch you disappear into a situation you do not understand. Rosalind folded her arms. The fire was beginning to warm the room, but she felt cold straight through to her bones. Start from the beginning, then, and speak plainly, because I am tired of riddles. Christopher pulled out the chair from behind the desk and sat down heavily. He looked older than his 28 years this morning. The shadows beneath his eyes told her he had not slept, and the stubble along his jaw confirmed it. My father left this estate in extraordinary debt, he said. When I inherited the title, I inherited obligations that would take 3 generations to repay through ordinary means. The land is mortgaged. The tenants' rents barely cover the interest. I had 2 choices: sell Oakhaven and dissolve the estate entirely, or find a financial arrangement that would settle the debts in a single stroke. And Lady Genevieve is that arrangement. Lady Genevieve's inheritance is that arrangement. She stands to receive a substantial trust from her late father's estate, but only under specific conditions written into his will. One of those conditions requires her to marry a titled gentleman before her 25th birthday, which falls in September. Her uncle, Lord Malachi Thorne, currently controls that trust as executor. He has refused to release the funds unless the marriage takes place under his direct supervision. Rosalind frowned. Why would her uncle care who she marries? Because as long as the inheritance remains in trust, Malachi controls every penny of it. The moment Genevieve marries and the trust dissolves, he loses that control permanently. So he has spent the last 4 years finding ways to delay, complicate, and obstruct any potential match. Christopher tapped the leather portfolio. This engagement is a legal contract with a strict expiration clause. If we fulfill the terms of the will, Genevieve receives her inheritance, a portion of which settles my estate debts as agreed between us. Once the financial obligation is met, the engagement dissolves. There is no wedding. There never was going to be a wedding. Rosalind stared at him. You expect me to believe that you announced a false engagement to the entire household, to the entire county, as some sort of business transaction? I expect you to believe it, because it is the truth. Then why did you not tell me before the announcement? You had every opportunity. You could have pulled me aside. You could have sent a note. You could have said one single word to prepare me. And instead, you stood in front of 40 people and declared your intention to marry another woman while I was standing 6 feet away, holding a tray of wine glasses. The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw Christopher flinch as though she had struck him across the face. The non-disclosure clause forbids me from revealing the nature of the arrangement to any member of my household staff prior to or following the public announcement, he said quietly. Malachi's solicitors drafted the language specifically to prevent leaks. If any servant or associate of mine is found to have knowledge of the contract's true terms, the agreement is voided. Genevieve loses her inheritance, and I lose Oakhaven. So you could not tell me because a piece of paper said you could not. I could not tell you because telling you would have destroyed everything I have spent the last 6 months building to save this house, my tenants, and their families. He leaned forward in the chair. I am telling you now because you forced my hand by leaving, and because I would rather lose this estate than lose you to something I could have prevented. The room went very still. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Outside, a wood pigeon called from the garden wall. Rosalind unfolded her arms slowly. What do you mean, something you could have prevented? You mentioned danger at the coaching station. What danger? Christopher stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the grounds for a long moment before speaking. Malachi Thorne has hired private investigators to monitor this estate. They are watching who comes and goes. They are reading the post. They are looking for any evidence that the engagement is a legal ruse, because if they can prove it, Malachi keeps control of the trust indefinitely. And what does that have to do with me? He turned from the window and met her eyes directly. Because if Malachi's men discover that I have a personal attachment to a housemaid, that the engagement is a sham, designed to protect a financial arrangement rather than a genuine marriage, they will use that information to void the contract. And they will start with you. They will find you wherever you go, Rosalind. They will question you, pressure you, and use anything you say as evidence against me and Genevieve both. Rosalind felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet, as though the house itself had tilted. You are saying I am already involved, whether I want to be or otherwise. I am saying you were involved the moment I allowed myself to care about you, and I should have been more careful, and I was not. And now we are both in a position that I cannot undo with a stagecoach ticket. She looked at the leather portfolio on the desk. The ribbon holding it shut was dark green, the color of old money and solicitors' offices. Whatever documents lay inside that binding, they had reshaped her life without her knowledge or consent. I want to see the contract, she said. I cannot show you the full terms. The clause. I do not care about your clause, Your Grace. You have just told me that my safety depends on an arrangement I had no part in making. I want to see the contract, or I walk out of this room and out of this house, and your investigators can find me on the road to Plymouth. Christopher looked at her for a long time. Then he untied the green ribbon and opened the portfolio halfway, turning it so she could read the first page. This is all I can show you, he said, for now. Rosalind stepped forward and looked down at the document. The legal language was dense and formal, but one paragraph near the bottom of the page was perfectly clear. It stated that the engagement between His Grace, the Duke of Oakhaven, and Lady Genevieve Thorne would be subject to automatic dissolution upon the verified fulfillment of all financial terms, with no obligation of marriage on either party. An expiration clause, exactly as he had described. Rosalind read it twice, then stepped back from the desk. I will stay, she said, for now, under my own terms. Name them. I am not your prisoner, and I am not your maid any longer. If I remain in this house, I remain as someone who knows the truth and has chosen to stay. And when this arrangement of yours is finished, You will owe me an explanation for every single thing you have kept from me." Christopher held her gaze and nodded. "Agreed." "Good." Rosalind picked up her carpet bag from the floor and walked toward the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. "And Your Grace, the next time you buy out an entire stagecoach to stop a woman from leaving, you might consider simply asking her to stay." She left the room without waiting for his reply, and Christopher stood alone in the dusty library, listening to her boots fade down the corridor. He looked down at the portfolio, and the contract spread across his desk. Beneath the first page, hidden under the dense legal text, lay a second document that Rosalind had not seen. A handwritten letter from Lord Malachi Thorne's solicitor, dated just 3 days earlier. It contained a single line that had kept Christopher awake all night. "We know about the girl." 2 days passed in an uneasy quiet. Rosalind had been moved from her attic room to a modest guest chamber in the north wing, a decision that raised eyebrows among the household staff, but was explained away by Mrs. Pemberton as a temporary reassignment for cataloging purposes. The North Wing Library contained several decades of unsorted estate records, and Rosalind's new official position was that of a records clerk tasked with organizing them. It was a thin excuse, and Rosalind suspected that at least half the servants saw through it. But nobody questioned the Duke's orders at Oakhaven, and so the whispers remained whispers. On the morning of the third day, Rosalind sat at the library desk with a cup of tea gone cold and a sheet of writing paper in front of her. She had been composing the same letter for over an hour, crossing out lines and starting fresh, until the paper was nearly ruined with ink. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper of Tregarron House in Cornwall, where Rosalind had worked for 2 years before coming to Oakhaven. Mrs. Calloway was a stern woman with a soft heart, and she had written Rosalind a generous reference when she left for Dorset. If anyone in England would take Rosalind back without asking difficult questions, it was Mrs. Calloway. Rosalind knew she had agreed to stay. She also knew that agreements made under pressure in dusty libraries at 7 o'clock in the morning were not the same as permanent decisions. Christopher had shown her 1 page of a contract and spoken fine words about protection and danger, but fine words were easy to produce, and Rosalind had learned young that the people who made the grandest promises were often the first to break them. She wanted a way out, a quiet one, just in case. She finished the letter, folded it carefully, and sealed it with a drop of plain wax. She addressed it to Tregarron House, Falmouth, Cornwall, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. The estate post was collected every morning at 10 o'clock from a wooden box mounted on the wall of the servants' entrance. A boy from the village carried it down to the post office at Dorset Cross, where the postmaster, Mr. Hadley, sorted it for the afternoon mail coach. Rosalind had used this system dozens of times during her months as a housemaid. It was simple and reliable. She waited until the corridor was empty, then walked downstairs and slipped the letter into the post box among the other outgoing correspondence. A bill for the farrier, a note from the cook requesting a delivery of sugar from the Dorchester merchant. Ordinary things. Rosalind returned to the library and tried to focus on the estate records spread across the desk. Ledgers from the 1820s. Tenant agreements written in faded brown ink. Receipts for sheep purchased at county fairs, long since forgotten. The work was tedious, but it kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, which was precisely what she needed. An hour later, the library door opened without a knock. Christopher walked in, carrying Rosalind's letter. He held it up between 2 fingers, the plain wax seal unbroken, and placed it on the desk in front of her, without a word. His expression was tight, controlled, and underneath it, Rosalind could see something that looked very much like fear. "You read my post," Rosalind said flatly. "I did not read it. I intercepted it before it reached the post office, which is a very different thing." It is a very similar thing when the result is the same. My private correspondence sitting on your desk instead of traveling to Cornwall. Christopher pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from her. Rosalind, I need you to listen to me carefully. I did not take your letter because I wished to control you or to read your private thoughts. I took it because there is a man standing outside the Dorset Cross post office who has been watching our estate mail for the past 5 days. Rosalind went still. What man? A gentleman in a brown traveling coat with a leather case. He arrives each morning at 9:30, positions himself on the bench across the lane from Mr. Hadley's office, and observes every piece of post that enters and leaves. My groundskeeper, Harwick, noticed him on Monday. I confirmed it myself yesterday from the hill above the village with a spyglass. One of Malachi Thorne's people. Almost certainly. Malachi has hired at least 2 private investigators that I am aware of. One is based in London and handles the legal surveillance. The other is local, and his task is to monitor the estate for any irregularity that could be used to challenge the engagement contract. Christopher gestured toward the sealed letter. A letter from the Duke of Oakhaven's household to a private residence in Cornwall, written in a hand that does not belong to any known member of the estate's clerical staff, would be exactly the kind of irregularity that man is looking for. Rosalind stared at the letter on the desk. Her chest felt tight. She had thought of this as a simple, quiet act, a private letter to a former employer, nothing more. The idea that such a small thing could be observed, intercepted, and used as evidence in a legal dispute she barely understood made her feel as though the walls of the room were drawing closer. What would he do with it? She asked. He would open it. He would read it. He would learn that a woman in the Duke's household is seeking alternative employment, barely 3 days after the engagement announcement, which suggests she has reason to believe the engagement will not last. From there, it takes very little effort to identify you, discover your position in the house, and begin asking questions about the nature of your relationship with me. There is no relationship. Christopher looked at her steadily. Malachi Thorne does not need the truth, Rosalind. He needs a plausible accusation. A housemaid secretly writing to former employers, a duke who chased her to a coaching station at dawn and bought out an entire stagecoach to prevent her departure. These are the ingredients of a scandal, and scandal is all Malachi requires to void the contract and keep Genevieve's inheritance locked away. Rosalind picked up the letter from the desk. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the folded paper and the small, hard circle of the wax seal. Such a small thing, such ordinary intentions behind it. So, I cannot leave, she said, and I cannot write to anyone who might help me leave. You can do both of those things once the engagement contract has been fulfilled and dissolved. That process should take no more than a few weeks, provided we can secure the necessary documents to prove that the terms of Genevieve's fathers will have been met. And if you cannot secure them? Christopher paused. It was a brief hesitation, barely half a second, but Rosalind caught it. The original documents are held in a registry office on the coast. I have reason to believe they contain information that could end this entire arrangement much sooner than Malachi expects. What kind of information? The kind that proves the will Malachi has been enforcing is not the same document that Genevieve's father originally signed. Christopher leaned forward. I need to travel to Weymouth to access those records, and I need someone with me who can help me search through 30 years of filed documents without drawing suspicion. Rosalind understood immediately. You want me to come with you, as my attending clerk. A duke traveling with a male secretary raises no eyebrows, and a duke traveling with a female records clerk raises only slightly more. We would be gone 3 days at most, and the man at the post office, Malachi's investigator, will see the Duke of Oakhaven departing on routine estate business with a member of his clerical staff. Nothing remarkable, Nothing worth reporting. Rosalind set the letter down on the desk and looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up, tore it neatly in half, and dropped both pieces into the fire grate. The paper caught instantly and curled into black ash. "When do we leave?" she said. Christopher stood from the chair. Something in his expression shifted, a loosening of the tension around his jaw, a flicker of relief behind his eyes that he did not quite manage to hide. "Day after tomorrow, early morning. Pack lightly and dress plainly." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "Rosalind." "Yes? Thank you. For staying." She picked up one of the old estate ledgers and opened it to a random page, as though the conversation had already ended. "Do not thank me yet, Your Grace. I have not decided whether I am staying for you or simply because you have made it impossible to leave." Christopher allowed himself the smallest trace of a smile, the first she had seen from him in days, and left the library without another word. Rosalind stared at the fire where her letter to Cornwall was already nothing but fine gray ash. Then she turned back to the ledgers and began making a list of every document she would need to search for in Weymouth. If she was trapped in this arrangement, she would at least make herself useful enough to help end it. They left Oakhaven before the kitchen fires were lit, slipping out through the stable yard in a plain black carriage drawn by two unremarkable horses. Christopher had chosen the older carriage deliberately, the one without the family crest painted on the door. It looked like the kind of vehicle a country solicitor might use for business travel, and that was precisely the impression he wanted. Rosalind wore a dark gray dress with a high collar and a simple bonnet that covered most of her hair. Christopher had lent her a pair of reading spectacles with clear glass lenses, which she thought was ridiculous until he pointed out that nobody remembered the face of a woman wearing spectacles. They remembered the spectacles instead. She had to admit it was clever. The coachman was Harwick, Christopher's groundskeeper, a man of 60, with thick forearms and very few words. He drove with the quiet confidence of someone who had handled horses his entire life, and saw no reason to discuss it. Christopher had chosen him because Harwick had served the estate since before Christopher was born, and would sooner cut off his own hand than betray the family's business to an outsider. The road from Dorset wound southwest, through rolling green hills still wet with morning dew. Sheep dotted the distant fields like drops of cream on a green tablecloth, and the hedgerows along the lane were thick with early hawthorn blossoms. It was beautiful country, the kind of landscape that appeared on painted tea trays, and in the watercolors of ladies who had never muddied their boots on actual farmland. Rosalind watched it pass through the carriage window and said nothing for the first hour. Christopher sat across from her with a leather satchel on his lap, reviewing documents he had pulled from the estate's private files. He read with a deep crease between his eyebrows, turning pages with the careful precision of a man searching for something specific and dreading what he might find. Somewhere past the village of Bridport, the road narrowed and began to follow the coastline. The land dropped away to the south, and through the carriage window, Rosalind caught her first glimpse of the sea, a vast, gray-blue expanse stretching toward the horizon beneath a sky full of low white clouds. The cliffs along this stretch of coast were layered in bands of pale stone and dark clay, carved by centuries of wind and tide into shapes that looked almost deliberate, as though some ancient mason had begun a cathedral and abandoned it halfway through. "The Jurassic coast," Christopher said, noticing her gaze. "My mother used to collect fossils along the beach below those cliffs when I was a boy. She had an entire cabinet of ammonites in the east drawing room." "I have never seen the sea from this angle before," Rosalind said. From Plymouth? You see it head-on, flat and enormous?" "From up here, it looks like something you could fall into. My mother said the same thing once." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "She died when I was 12. Scarlet fever. My father was never the same after that." Rosalind turned from the window. This was more than Christopher had ever shared with her in 11 months of quiet conversations over evening tea. She waited, sensing that the carriage and the empty road and the miles between them and Oakhaven had loosened something in him that the walls of the manor kept tightly sealed. He began spending, Christopher continued, his eyes fixed on the documents in his lap, though he was clearly no longer reading them. At first it was understandable. Grief does strange things to people, and my father's particular grief expressed itself through grand gestures. A new wing added to the house that nobody needed, a stable full of racehorses that never won anything, paintings purchased at auction in London for sums that would have fed the tenants for a year. And nobody stopped him. Who would stop a duke? His solicitors advised caution. His steward resigned in protest and was replaced with a man who agreed with everything my father said. By the time I came of age and inherited the title, the debts were so deep that selling the paintings and the horses barely covered the interest. The carriage jolted over a rough patch of road, and Christopher steadied the satchel on his lap. I spent my first year as Duke simply learning the true extent of what I owed. Every month, another creditor appeared with a ledger and a claim I had never heard of. Loans taken against the estate's future harvests. Mortgages on land my family had held for 200 years. Personal debts to gentlemen's clubs in London that my father had apparently frequented under a false name. Rosalind felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She had spent 11 months in that house, polishing silver and laying fires and serving dinner on porcelain plates, and she had assumed, as servants always assumed, that the grandeur was real, that the heavy curtains and the crystal decanters and the imported French wine meant what they appeared to mean: wealth, stability, permanence. "How bad is it?" she asked. "If I do nothing, the estate will be seized by creditors within 18 months. The tenants, 43 families who depend on Oakhaven land for their livelihoods, will be displaced. The house itself will likely be sold to some Manchester industrialist who will tear out the gardens and build a textile mill. And Lady Genevieve's inheritance prevents all of that. A portion of it, yes, enough to settle the most urgent debts and restructure the remainder into something manageable. In exchange, Genevieve receives a titled engagement that satisfies the conditions of her father's will and releases her trust from Malachi's control. Once the trust is released and the debts are settled, the engagement dissolves. She is free to marry her naval officer, and I am free to—" He stopped himself. "Free to do what?" Rosalind asked quietly. Christopher looked at her directly for the first time since the carriage had left Oakhaven. His eyes were the color of the sea outside the window, gray with flecks of something deeper underneath. "Free to make the choices I should have been allowed to make from the beginning," he said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite prepared to address openly. Rosalind held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "Tell me about the documents we are looking for in Weymouth," she said, steering the conversation back to solid ground. Christopher accepted the turn without protest. He opened the leather satchel and spread several papers across the seat beside him. Genevieve's father, Lord Aldrich Thorne, established his daughter's trust in 1832 through a formal deed registered with the Weymouth Town Registry. The version of the will currently held by Malachi's solicitors states that Genevieve must marry a titled gentleman before her 25th birthday to claim the inheritance. But I have reason to believe that the original deed contained different terms entirely. Different how? A colleague of my late father, a retired solicitor named Pembroke, wrote to me 6 months ago claiming he had witnessed the original signing of the trust deed. He said the marriage clause was not present in the document Lord Aldrich actually signed. It was added later, after Lord Aldrich's death, by someone with access to the registry files. Rosalind felt the hair rise along the back of her neck. Malachi? Almost certainly. If we can locate the original registered copy in the Weymouth archives and prove that it differs from the version Malachi has been enforcing, the entire basis for the forced marriage condition collapses. Genevieve gets her inheritance outright. The engagement contract becomes unnecessary, and Malachi loses everything. And you believe this original document still exists in the registry? Registry offices in small coastal towns are not known for their efficiency. Documents filed 30 years ago tend to stay exactly where they were put. He closed the satchel, which is why I need someone with a sharp eye and a talent for finding things that have been buried under decades of neglect. Rosalind adjusted the useless spectacles on her nose. You are fortunate, then, that your records clerk is very good at her job. Christopher leaned back against the seat and allowed the tension in his shoulders to ease just slightly. Outside, the cliffs of the Jurassic coast rolled past like the spine of some ancient sleeping creature, and the road ahead curved toward Weymouth and whatever waited for them in its dusty archives. They rode on in a silence that felt, for the first time, less like distance and more like trust, beginning to form between two people who had spent too long standing on opposite sides of a locked door. The Weymouth Town Registry Office was a squat stone building wedged between a chandler's shop and a public house on a narrow street 2 blocks from the harbor. Its front door was painted green, though the paint had peeled badly enough to reveal 3 previous colors underneath. White, then brown, then a shade of yellow that must have seemed like a good idea to someone decades ago. Christopher pushed the door open, and a small brass bell jangled overhead. The interior smelled of dust, old ink, and the faintly briny air that crept in from the harbor through cracks in the window frames. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound ledgers, bundles of yellowed papers tied with string, and wooden filing boxes, stacked so high they appeared to lean against one another for support, like elderly gentlemen dozing in a club. Behind a counter near the entrance sat a thin man with wire spectacles and a waistcoat buttoned crookedly. He was eating a meat pie over an open ledger, and crumbs had settled into the binding like tiny geological deposits. "Help you?" he said, without looking up. "I am here on behalf of the Sterling estate in Dorset," Christopher said, using the formal tone Rosalind had heard him employ with tradesmen and solicitors. "I require access to the trust and deed registry for the year 1832, specifically filings made under the name Lord Aldrich Thorne of Somerset." The clerk finally looked up. He took in Christopher's well-cut traveling coat, the polished boots, the posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and set his meat pie aside with sudden interest. "Trust filings from 32, you say? That would be in the East Archive Room. 30 years of records in there, sir. Could take some time to locate a specific document. That is why I have brought my clerk." Christopher gestured toward Rosalind, who stood just behind him with a leather writing case tucked under her arm. "She will conduct the search. I trust you have no objection to us using the archive room for the morning." The clerk glanced at Rosalind with the particular expression men reserved for women who appeared in places they did not expect to find them. Rosalind met his gaze through her borrowed spectacles and kept her face perfectly blank. "No objection, sir. Through that door and down the corridor. Mind the step. The floor drops about 4 inches where the old building meets the new." The East Archive Room was worse than Rosalind had imagined. It was a long, narrow space with a single window at the far end that admitted just enough light to make the dust visible as it drifted through the air. 3 rows of wooden shelving ran the length of the room, each one packed with documents organized by year, though the word organized was generous. The ledgers for 1830 had been shelved next to those from 1841. A bundle marked Deeds Miscellaneous sat on top of a crate labeled Harbor Fees, 1828. Someone at some point had attempted a filing system using colored ribbons. but the ribbons had faded to identical shades of gray and now served no purpose whatsoever. 30 years of records, Rosalind murmured, surveying the chaos. This will be like finding a particular grain of sand on a beach. A grain of sand that could save 43 families from losing their homes, Christopher reminded her. Rosalind removed her bonnet, hung it on a nail protruding from the nearest shelf, and rolled up her sleeves. Then we had better start looking. They divided the room in half. Christopher took the left side, working through the shelves closest to the door, while Rosalind began at the far end near the window. The system she devised was simple. Pull each ledger and bundle from the shelf, check the dates and names on the covers, set aside anything from 1832, and return everything else. It was slow, dusty, tedious work, and within an hour her fingers were gray with old ink, and her back ached from bending over crates stacked on the floor. Christopher worked with less method and more frustration. He opened ledgers, scanned pages, closed them, and moved on with the restless energy of a man who wanted answers faster than the world was prepared to deliver them. Twice he knocked a stack of papers from a shelf, and twice Rosalind heard him swear under his breath as he gathered them from the floor. "Your Grace," Rosalind said after the second incident, "you are going to bury the document we need under an avalanche of harbor fees if you keep pulling things off the shelves at that speed. I am aware. Then perhaps slow down and read the labels before you grab." He looked at her across the room with an expression that was half annoyance and half reluctant admiration. "You are very comfortable giving orders to a duke. You promoted me to clerk. Clerks are paid to be particular." By midday, they had narrowed the search to a single shelf on Rosalind's side of the room. The ledgers from 1832 were gathered in a loose cluster, and among them was a thin wooden filing box with a handwritten label that read, "Thorne, Trust Deed and Amendments, filed March 1832. Rosalind carried the box to a small reading table beneath the window and opened the lid carefully. Inside were several documents, each one folded and sealed with wax that had cracked and darkened with age. She lifted them out one by one and laid them flat on the table. "Christopher," she said, forgetting his title entirely in the concentration of the moment. He was beside her within seconds. The first document was a standard trust registration form, filled out in the careful copperplate handwriting of a professional solicitor. It established a trust in the name of Miss Genevieve Thorne, daughter of Lord Aldrich Thorne, to be held by the Weymouth County Bank and released upon her 25th birthday. Rosalind read the critical passage aloud. "Upon the occasion of her 25th year, the full sum and all accumulated interest shall be released to Miss Genevieve Thorne without condition or encumbrance." She looked up at Christopher. "Without condition, no marriage clause." Christopher reached past her and picked up the second document in the box. This one was different. The paper was slightly newer, the ink a shade darker, and the handwriting, while similar, had subtle differences that Rosalind's trained eye caught immediately. The loops on the letter D were tighter, the crossbars on the letter T sat higher on the stem. "This is the amended version," Christopher said, his voice low and tight. "Look at the date. The amendment was dated November 1834, 2 full years after the original filing, and 8 months after Lord Aldrich Thorne's recorded date of death. Someone had added the marriage clause to the trust deed after the man who created it was already in his grave." "Malachi," Rosalind whispered. "Malachi." Christopher set the document down with exaggerated care, as though he was afraid that gripping it any harder would tear it in half. He waited until his brother was dead, then filed an amendment to the trust, under his authority, as executor. He added the marriage condition to ensure that Genevieve could never access her inheritance without his involvement and approval. Can this be proven in court? That the amendment is fraudulent? With both documents side by side, any magistrate in England would see the discrepancy. The original has no marriage condition. The amendment was filed after Lord Aldrich's death by a man who stood to benefit directly from keeping the inheritance locked away. Christopher gathered both documents carefully and placed them back in the filing box. "This is everything we need." Rosalind watched him close the lid and tuck the box under his arm. His hands were trembling slightly, and she realized that for all his composure, this moment mattered to him more than he would ever willingly show. This was Oakhaven. This was 43 families. This was the difference between keeping and losing everything his family had built over 2 centuries. "We should leave," she said gently, "before the clerk finishes his second meat pie and decides to ask questions about what we found." Christopher managed a short, breathless laugh. "Agreed." They walked back through the corridor, past the counter where the clerk was indeed eating another pie, and out into the bright midday street. The harbor was visible at the end of the lane, crowded with fishing boats and merchant vessels, and the salt air hit Rosalind's face like a cold, clean hand after the staleness of the archive room. "We should find a place to eat and plan our return journey," Christopher said, tucking the filing box inside his traveling coat. "There is a quiet inn near the South Quay that should serve us well enough." They walked together down the narrow street toward the harbor, and Rosalind noticed that for the first time since she had known him, Christopher Sterling walked like a man who had set down something enormously heavy. She also noticed that his hand, hanging at his side as they walked, was close enough to hers that their fingers nearly touched. She did not pull away. The Seabreeze Inn sat at the far end of the South Quay, a whitewashed building with low ceilings and salt-streaked windows that overlooked the harbor. It was the kind of place frequented by ship captains and wool merchants, respectable enough for a gentleman, but ordinary enough to avoid attention. Christopher had chosen it for precisely that reason. They took a table in the back corner, away from the window. The innkeeper, a stout woman with flour on her apron, brought them cold roast beef, bread, pickled onions, and a pot of strong tea, without being asked. Weymouth was a working town, and the meals reflected it, plain, generous, and served without ceremony. Rosalind ate with genuine hunger. The morning in the archive room had drained her more than she expected, and the bread was fresh enough to remind her that she had skipped breakfast entirely. Christopher ate less, his attention divided between his plate and the filing box resting on the bench beside him, hidden beneath his traveling coat. "We should take the coast road back tomorrow morning," he said, keeping his voice low. "Harwick will have the carriage ready at the livery stable by 6. If we leave at first light, we can be back at Oakhaven by late afternoon." "And then what? You take these documents to a magistrate?" "To the county magistrate in Dorchester. He has jurisdiction over trust disputes in this region. Once he sees the original deed alongside the fraudulent amendment, he can issue a ruling that voids the marriage clause entirely." "How long will that take?" "A matter of days, if the magistrate acts quickly. Weeks, if Malachi's solicitors manage to file an objection and delay proceedings." Christopher poured tea into both cups. "The important thing is that we have the documents. Without them, Malachi's version of the will stands unchallenged. With them, his entire scheme falls apart." Rosalind wrapped her hands around the warm cup and considered the enormity of what they had accomplished in a single morning. 2 pieces of paper, yellowed with age and buried under decades of neglect, held the power to free Genevieve from her uncle's control, release Christopher from a false engagement, and save 43 families from displacement. It seemed almost absurd that so much could depend on something so fragile. "You should make copies," she said, "before we return. If something happens to the originals, we lose everything." Christopher nodded. "There is a solicitor's office near the harbor. I will have certified copies drawn up this afternoon and send them by separate post to my own solicitor in London. If the originals are lost or stolen, the copies will serve as evidence that they existed. You think Malachi would try to steal them?" I think Malachi has spent 4 years manipulating his dead brother's estate for personal gain. A man who forges legal documents would not hesitate to destroy them if he thought they threatened his position. The innkeeper returned to clear their plates, and the conversation paused. Rosalind glanced around the room. The lunch crowd had thinned, and most of the remaining patrons were dock workers finishing their ale before returning to the quay. An elderly couple sat near the fireplace, sharing a pot of soup. A young sailor was reading a letter by the window, with the slow, careful movements of a man who found reading difficult. And in the far corner, near the door, a man in a dark brown coat was watching them. Rosalind noticed him because he was doing everything a person does when they are trying to appear as though they are not watching something. He had a newspaper open in front of him, but his eyes were not moving across the print. His ale was untouched. His posture was angled slightly toward their table, and every few seconds his gaze flicked in their direction with the practiced subtlety of someone trained in observation. Rosalind leaned forward and spoke quietly. "There is a man by the door. Brown coat, dark hair, newspaper he has not turned a page of since we sat down." Christopher did not look. His hand, which had been reaching for his teacup, stopped midway and returned to the table. "Describe him." 40 or so, clean-shaven. Well-dressed for a dockside inn, he has a leather case beside his chair, the kind a solicitor might carry. "That is Garrett Whitmore. He is Malachi Thorne's chief investigator." Rosalind's stomach dropped. "You know him?" "I know of him. Malachi's solicitor mentioned his name in a letter I received last week. He is a former Bow Street officer who now works privately for wealthy clients with delicate legal problems." Christopher's voice remained perfectly steady, but Rosalind noticed that his jaw had tightened and the color had drained slightly from his face. "He should be in Dorset, watching the estate. The fact that he is here in Weymouth means he followed us, which means he knows we came to the registry office. Does he know what we found? He cannot know that. The registry clerk would not have spoken to a stranger about our business, and we took the documents with us. But Whitmore is not a fool. A duke traveling to a coastal town with a young woman who does not match the description of his betrothed, visiting a registry office where his fiancé's family trust was filed. Those facts tell a story on their own." Rosalind felt the air in the room change, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. She became acutely aware of the filing box hidden beneath Christopher's coat on the bench, and of how little distance separated them from the man by the door. "What do we do?" she asked. "We finish our tea. We pay our bill. We walk out calmly and give him no reason to approach us." Christopher paused. "And if he does approach, you are my estate clerk, accompanying me on routine legal business related to a land boundary dispute with a neighboring property. You do not know Lady Genevieve. You have never heard the name Thorne. Can you manage that? I have spent 11 months carrying wine trays past rooms full of people who treated me as though I were part of the furniture. I can manage a conversation with one man." Christopher almost smiled. Almost. They finished their tea in silence. Christopher paid the innkeeper, collected his coat with the filing box hidden carefully inside, and offered Rosalind his arm as they walked toward the door. It was a natural, unremarkable gesture, a gentleman escorting a female companion, but Rosalind felt the tension in his forearm as though the muscle had been wound tight like a clock spring. They were 3 steps from the door when the man in the brown coat folded his newspaper, stood, and stepped directly into their path. "Your Grace," he said, with a polite bow that did not reach his eyes. "A pleasure to encounter you so far from home. I am Garrett Whitmore. I believe we have mutual acquaintances in Somerset." Christopher stopped and regarded the man with the particular brand of aristocratic disinterest that only a duke could produce convincingly. "Mr. Whitmore, I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not, sir, which is why I took the liberty. I am an associate of Lord Malachi Thorne. I understand you are recently engaged to his niece, Lady Genevieve. A joyful occasion for both families. Indeed. Was there something you required, Mr. Whitmore? I am in the middle of estate business and must be on my way. Whitmore's gaze slid toward Rosalind. It lingered for just a moment too long, assessing, cataloging, filing her face away for future reference. And this is? Miss Vance, my records clerk. She is assisting me with a property boundary matter that required consultation of the local registry. Christopher's tone carried the unmistakable suggestion that explaining his business to a stranger was beneath his station, and that this conversation had already lasted longer than it deserved. Whitmore smiled thinly. Of course, Your Grace. A property matter. I shall not keep you. He stepped aside and held the door open for them with exaggerated courtesy. Do give Lady Genevieve my regards when you return to Oakhaven. I shall pass along your name, Christopher said, which was the kind of response that sounded polite, but contained a quiet warning underneath. They walked out into the harbor air, and Rosalind kept her pace measured and unhurried, even though every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run. They crossed the quay in silence, turned down a side street toward the livery stable, and did not speak until they were safely inside the stable yard, with the doors closed behind them. Rosalind leaned against the wooden gate and let out a long, shaking breath. He knows. He suspects. There is a difference, and that difference is what keeps us safe for now. Christopher pulled the filing box from his coat and checked that the documents were undamaged. But we need to leave Weymouth today. Forget tomorrow morning. I will find Harwick and have the carriage ready within the hour. And the certified copies? We will have to manage without them. The originals are what matter, and I want them as far from Garrett Whitmore as possible before the sun sets. Rosalind straightened up from the gate. Her hands were still trembling, and she pressed them flat against her skirt to steady them. Christopher. He turned. That man looked at me like he was memorizing my face. I know. Christopher's voice was low and certain. He will not get the chance to use what he memorized. I promise you that. He went to find Harwick, and Rosalind stood alone in the stable yard, listening to the gulls crying over the harbor and the distant clatter of rigging against masts. She thought about the filing box and the two fragile documents inside it, and about a man in a brown coat who smiled like a closed door. They were leaving Weymouth with everything they came for, but they were also leaving with something they had not expected. A witness who had seen them together, and who would carry that information straight back to Lord Malachi Thorne. The race, Rosalind understood, had truly begun. The journey home took longer than the journey out. Harwick drove the carriage along back roads and farming lanes instead of the main coastal route, adding hours to the trip, but reducing the chance of being followed. Christopher had instructed him before they left the Weymouth stable yard: avoid the toll roads, stay off the turnpikes, and take the inland route through the villages where a plain black carriage would blend into the ordinary traffic of market carts and hay wagons. They arrived at Oakhaven Manor on the morning of the 9th day, dusty, stiff, and exhausted. Rosalind had slept poorly at the coaching inn where they had stopped overnight, sharing a room with a merchant's wife who snored with the steady rhythm of a sawmill. Christopher had taken a room across the hall, and, judging by the shadows beneath his eyes, had not slept at all. The estate looked exactly as they had left it. The gravel drive was freshly raked. The hedges along the front approach were trimmed. The windows of the east wing caught the morning sunlight and threw it back in long rectangles across the lawn. Everything spoke of order, permanence, and calm, the kind of calm that expensive houses were built to project regardless of what was happening behind their walls. Harwick brought the carriage to a stop at the side entrance, and Christopher climbed out first, offering his hand to Rosalind. She took it briefly and stepped down onto the gravel, stretching her back after the long hours of sitting. Home, she said, and then caught herself, because Oakhaven was not her home, and she had no right to call it that. Christopher did not correct her. He was looking at the front of the house with a fixed expression, and Rosalind followed his gaze to the main entrance, where a second carriage was parked. This one was considerably finer than theirs, a polished, dark blue coach with brass fittings and a family crest painted on the door in silver and gold. 2 matched gray horses stood in the traces, attended by a liveried coachman who was feeding them oats from a canvas bag. "Whose carriage is that?" Rosalind asked. Christopher studied the crest on the door for a long moment. "That is the Thorne family coach." Rosalind's chest tightened immediately. "Malachi? The crest is the same, but the livery colors are different. Malachi's coachman wears green. That man is wearing dark blue." Christopher's expression shifted from tension to something closer to cautious relief. "That is Genevieve's personal coach. She has come here herself." They entered through the side door and found Mrs. Pemberton waiting in the corridor with her hands clasped in front of her apron and the particular look of controlled alarm that housekeepers wore when unexpected guests arrived before the silver had been polished. "Your Grace," she said, "Lady Genevieve Thorne arrived yesterday evening and has been accommodated in the blue guest suite. She requested a private audience with you at your earliest convenience. I have taken the liberty of serving her breakfast in the drawing room." "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. Has Lady Genevieve spoken to anyone else in the household?" "She has been very quiet, Your Grace, kept to herself entirely. She brought her own lady's maid and has made very few requests." Christopher handed his traveling coat to a waiting footman and turned to Rosalind. "Come with me. To meet your fiancée? To meet the woman who is as trapped in this arrangement as I am. She should hear what we found in Weymouth, and she should hear it from both of us." The drawing room was a large, well-proportioned space, with pale green wallpaper, a marble fireplace, and tall windows that overlooked the south garden. Lady Genevieve Thorne was seated in a high-backed chair near the fire, a cup of chocolate cooling on the small table beside her. She was younger than Rosalind had expected, perhaps 23 or 24, with light brown hair arranged in a simple style and a face that was pleasant and open and entirely lacking the haughty superiority that Rosalind had been bracing herself to encounter. Genevieve stood when they entered and greeted Christopher with a brief, businesslike handshake rather than the curtsy a fiancé might have offered. It was the handshake of a woman conducting a transaction, and Rosalind noted it with quiet interest. "Christopher, thank you for receiving me. I apologize for arriving without notice, but I had reason to believe that written correspondence was no longer safe." Genevieve's eyes moved to Rosalind, and her expression became curious. "And this is?" "Miss Rosalind Vance. She is aware of the nature of our arrangement, and she has been instrumental in a discovery I need to share with you." Genevieve studied Rosalind for a moment with the calm, appraising intelligence of a woman who was accustomed to reading people quickly. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her, because she smiled and gestured toward the chairs. "Please, sit down, both of you. I have rather a lot to tell you as well." Christopher briefed Genevieve on the Weymouth trip, the documents they had found, and the encounter with Garrett Whitmore at the inn. Genevieve listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression growing steadily more focused as the implications became clear. "You have the original deed," she said when he finished, "the one my father actually signed, and the fraudulent amendment filed after his death, in your uncle's handwriting." Genevieve closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were bright with something that Rosalind recognized as fury held very tightly in check. "I was 9 years old when my father died. My uncle told me the marriage clause had always been part of the trust. I grew up believing I had no choice, that my father himself had decided I could not have my own inheritance unless I married according to terms he had set. I spent 15 years resenting a dead man for a condition he never imposed. The room was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted in the grate, and a log settled with a soft hiss. "I am sorry," Christopher said. "Do not be sorry. Be fast. Get those documents to the magistrate before my uncle learns they exist." Genevieve turned to Rosalind. "Miss Vance, would you walk with me? I find I need some air, and I would like to speak with you privately, if you are willing." Rosalind glanced at Christopher, who nodded slightly. She followed Genevieve through the garden doors and out onto the stone terrace that ran along the south side of the house. The morning air was fresh and cool, and the garden stretched below them in neat rows of early roses and clipped boxwood. Genevieve walked to the balustrade and rested her hands on the stone. "I want you to know something, Miss Vance. I have no intention of marrying Christopher Sterling. I never did. He is a decent man, and I respect him, but my heart belongs to someone else entirely." "The naval officer," Rosalind said, before she could stop herself. Genevieve turned to look at her with raised eyebrows. "Christopher told you about William? He mentioned that you had an attachment elsewhere. He did not share details." "Lieutenant William Hale of the Royal Navy. We have been in love since I was 19, and my uncle has spent 4 years ensuring that we could never marry by holding my inheritance hostage to his conditions." Genevieve's voice was steady, but there was an ache underneath it that Rosalind understood instinctively. "This engagement with Christopher is a legal maneuver designed to break my uncle's hold on my trust. Once the inheritance is released, I intend to marry William within the month." Rosalind looked out at the garden. A blackbird was singing from the top of the rose arbor, and the sound was so ordinary and so peaceful that it seemed to belong to a different world than the one they were standing in. "Why are you telling me this?" Rosalind asked. Genevieve smiled, a real, warm, slightly tired smile. "Because I saw the way Christopher looked at you when you walked into that drawing room, and I saw the way you looked at him, and I want you to know that you are not competing with me for anything. You never were." Christopher agreed to this arrangement because he had no other way to save his estate, and he has carried the weight of it like a man drowning in shallow water, close enough to the surface to see the air, but unable to reach it. She paused and looked directly at Rosalind. "You are the air, Miss Vance. I do not say that to flatter you. I say it because I recognize that particular kind of suffocation. I lived with it for 4 years before William." Rosalind felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had been carrying since the evening of the engagement announcement. She had spent days telling herself that the ache she felt was pride, or betrayal, or simple foolishness. Standing here on this terrace with the woman Christopher was supposed to marry, hearing her speak with such frank and unguarded honesty, Rosalind understood for the first time that the ache was something far simpler and far more frightening. She had been in love with Christopher Sterling since long before that evening in the Great Hall, and he had been in love with her, and the only thing standing between them was a dead man's forged will and a greedy uncle who had spent 15 years stealing from his own niece. "Thank you," Rosalind said quietly, "for telling me. Thank me when this is over and we are both free women." Genevieve straightened up from the balustrade. "Now, shall we go back inside? I believe your Duke has a magistrate to visit, and I have a letter to write to a certain lieutenant who is very tired of waiting." They walked back into the house together, and for the first time since Rosalind had arrived at Oakhaven Manor 11 months ago, the drawing room felt like a place where honesty lived. 3 days later, Rosalind found herself in a borrowed dress, riding in Genevieve's polished blue coach toward the one place in England she least wanted to visit. Thorne Hall sat on the Somerset border, a sprawling grey stone estate, surrounded by formal gardens and ancient oak trees that had been planted, according to Genevieve, by her grandfather in the last century. The house itself was handsome in the way that wealthy men's houses often were, large, symmetrical, and designed to communicate power to anyone approaching the front drive. Every window was lit, and the gravel forecourt was already crowded with carriages when they arrived. Lord Malachi Thorne was hosting a dinner party. The invitation had arrived at Oakhaven 2 days after Genevieve. A thick cream envelope, sealed with the Thorne family crest, addressed to the Duke of Oakhaven and his betrothed, requesting the pleasure of their company at an intimate gathering to celebrate the upcoming union of the two families. The language was warm, generous, and entirely false. Christopher had read it aloud at the breakfast table, with the flat expression of a man being handed a loaded pistol wrapped in silk ribbon. "He wants to inspect us," Christopher had said. "He wants to see us together in his own territory, under his own roof, where he controls the evening. Then we give him exactly what he expects to see," Genevieve had replied, buttering her toast with remarkable calm. A duke and his fiancée, attending a family dinner, smiling, pleasant, thoroughly convincing. The plan had taken shape over the following 48 hours, discussed in low voices in the North Wing library, with the door locked and the curtains drawn. It was Genevieve's idea, and Rosalind had to admit it was elegant in its simplicity. Malachi had the fraudulent amendment. Christopher had the original trust deed. But to present both documents to the magistrate simultaneously, proving beyond dispute that the amendment was forged, they needed the copy of the amendment that Malachi kept in his private study. The version held by his solicitors in London could be dismissed as a clerk's copy. The version in Malachi's personal safe was the one bearing the original wax seal and the forged signature. That was the document that would end this. Genevieve would attend the dinner as Christopher's fiancée, keeping her uncle occupied in the ballroom for the duration of the evening. Christopher and Rosalind, arriving separately under the guise of estate staff accompanying the Duke's party, would slip away during the meal and search Malachi's private study for the safe. "My uncle's study is on the first floor, east corridor, third door from the staircase," Genevieve had told them, sketching a rough map on a sheet of writing paper. "He keeps it locked when he entertains, but the lock is old, a lever mechanism, the kind used in most country houses, built before the turn of the century. The safe is behind a painting of my grandfather, above the fireplace. I have seen him open it once, when I was 16, and he thought I was in the garden." "And you remember the location after all these years?" Christopher had asked. "I remember everything about that house. I grew up in it. I know which floorboards creak, which doors stick, and which servants go to bed early. My uncle took my inheritance, Christopher. I have spent a very long time paying attention." The carriage pulled into the forecourt at 7:30. The evening was cool, and lanterns had been hung along the entrance colonnade, casting warm yellow light across the arriving guests. Rosalind watched from the window as Christopher stepped out in his finest evening coat, offering his arm to Genevieve, who wore a blue silk gown and a smile that could have convinced a magistrate, let alone an uncle. They looked, Rosalind thought with a sharp pang beneath her ribs, like a perfect couple. She pushed the feeling aside. There was work to do. Rosalind entered through the servants' entrance at the rear of the house, carrying a leather writing case and wearing the plain dark dress of a traveling clerk. Genevieve had arranged for her name to be added to the servants' list as a temporary attendant accompanying the Duke's party, which gave her legitimate reason to be inside the house without raising questions. The servants' hall was busy with the organized chaos of a formal dinner in progress. Kitchen maids carried platters of roasted pheasant and buttered vegetables toward the dining room. Footmen adjusted their gloves and straightened their waistcoats before carrying decanters of wine up the service stairs. Nobody paid Rosalind the slightest attention. She was a woman in a dark dress carrying a case, and in a house full of servants preparing a 12-course meal, she was invisible. She climbed the back staircase to the first floor and turned east along the corridor. The sounds of the dinner party drifted up from below, the clink of crystal, the murmur of conversation, and somewhere beneath it all, the low, confident voice of Lord Malachi Thorne, welcoming his guests and playing the generous host. Third door from the staircase. Rosalind stopped and tried the handle. Locked, as Genevieve had predicted. She set the writing case on the floor and opened it. Inside, alongside blank paper and a pen for appearances, she had packed a set of thin steel picks that had belonged to her grandfather, a locksmith in Plymouth, who had taught Rosalind the trade before his death when she was 13. She had never told anyone at Oakhaven about her grandfather's profession. Locksmiths' daughters did not typically become housemaids, and the skill was not one that polite society encouraged in young women. The lever mechanism took her 40 seconds. The door swung inward with a soft click, and Rosalind stepped inside, closing it behind her. Malachi's study was richly furnished, dark wood paneling, a Persian carpet, a massive mahogany desk with brass handles, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes arranged by color rather than subject, which told Rosalind everything she needed to know about Malachi's relationship with actual reading. The room smelled of cigar smoke and brandy, and the fireplace was cold and swept clean. Above the mantelpiece hung a large oil portrait of an older gentleman with white side whiskers and a stern mouth. Genevieve's grandfather. Rosalind crossed the room, took hold of the gilt frame, and swung the painting outward on its hinges. Behind it was a wall safe, iron, with a brass dial and a keyhole beneath it. Older than Rosalind had expected, the kind of safe that country gentlemen had installed in the 1820s, when security meant a heavy door and a simple lock, rather than the complex combination mechanisms now coming into fashion. She had just reached for her picks when the study door opened behind her. Christopher slipped inside, breathing harder than he should have been. Genevieve has him in the ballroom. She asked him to introduce her to the Somerset magistrate and his wife, which should keep him occupied for at least 20 minutes. How are we progressing? Ask me again in 5 minutes, Rosalind said, and turned back to the safe. The lock was a double lever design, more complex than the door, but built from the same era of craftsmanship. Rosalind worked the picks with steady hands, feeling for the resistance points inside the mechanism. Her grandfather had taught her to listen with her fingers. Every lock had a voice, he used to say, and if you were patient enough, it would tell you its secrets. The first lever turned after 3 minutes. The second caught briefly, then released with a satisfying click. The safe door swung open. Inside were several leather pouches, a wooden box containing what appeared to be old coins, a bundle of personal letters tied with twine, and a single document folded and sealed with dark red wax bearing the Thorne family crest. Rosalind lifted it out and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting matched the fraudulent amendment they had found in Weymouth. The same tight loops on the letter D, the same high crossbars on the letter T. The wax seal was intact, and at the bottom of the page was a signature that read, Lord Malachi Thorne, Executor, in a confident slanting hand. "This is it," she whispered. "The original amendment, the one with his seal." Christopher took the document and examined it under the dim light from the window. His jaw tightened as he read the forged marriage clause. The single paragraph that had controlled his life, Genevieve's life, and the fate of Oakhaven Manor for the past 4 years. "Take it," Rosalind said. "We have what we came for." Christopher folded the document, slid it inside his coat, and closed the safe. Rosalind swung the painting back into position and checked that nothing in the room appeared disturbed. The desk was untouched. The carpet showed no footprints. The cigar smoke still hung in the air exactly as it had when she entered. Then they both heard the footsteps. Someone was walking along the east corridor toward the study door. The steps were measured, deliberate, and growing louder with each second. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Rosalind's body went cold. She looked at Christopher, and he looked at her, and in that single frozen second, an entire conversation passed between them without a word. The corridor outside was narrow. The study had one door and two windows, both of which overlooked a 15-foot drop to the stone terrace below. There was no second exit, no servant's passage, no convenient back staircase. Christopher moved first. He took Rosalind's arm and guided her swiftly toward the far corner of the room, where a pair of heavy velvet drapes hung from brass rings on either side of the tall window. The drapes were deep burgundy, floor-length, and thick enough to hide a person if that person pressed herself flat against the wall and remembered to breathe very quietly. Rosalind stepped behind the left drape and pulled the fabric around herself. The velvet smelled of dust and old tobacco and something faintly metallic, like brass polish. She could see nothing. The fabric pressed against her face, and she closed her eyes and focused on keeping her breathing slow and shallow. Through the curtain, she heard Christopher cross the room in 3 quick strides. She heard the creak of a floorboard near the desk, then silence. He was positioning himself somewhere, she could not tell where, and she had to trust that whatever he was doing would work. The door handle turned. The door opened with a slow, measured push, and a wedge of light from the corridor lanterns fell across the carpet. Rosalind heard a man's footsteps enter the room, heavier than the ones in the corridor, which meant the person had been walking carefully outside and was now moving more naturally. A single person, male, judging by the weight of the tread. "Who left this open?" a voice muttered. The voice was unfamiliar to Rosalind. It was not the deep, confident baritone she had imagined belonging to Lord Malachi Thorne. This voice was younger, thinner, with the clipped vowels of a man who had been educated expensively and retained very little of the education. Footsteps crossed to the desk. A drawer opened, then closed. Papers rustled. The man was searching for something specific, moving through the desk contents with the familiarity of someone who had done this before. Then the footsteps stopped. A long pause followed, the kind of pause that meant the person was looking at something, or listening, or sensing that the room was not quite as empty as it should have been. "Draughty tonight," the man said to himself, and Rosalind heard the window latch click shut. He had been standing within 2 feet of her, close enough that she could hear the fabric of his coat sleeve brush against the curtain as he reached for the latch. She did not move. She did not breathe. The footsteps retreated toward the door. The man paused again at the threshold, and Rosalind heard him strike a match. The sharp smell of sulfur cut through the stale air, followed by the sweeter scent of cigar smoke. He stood there for what felt like an entire year, smoking and looking back into the dark room, and then he stepped into the corridor and pulled the door shut behind him. The latch caught. The footsteps faded down the corridor toward the staircase, growing softer until they disappeared entirely beneath the distant sounds of the dinner party below. Rosalind waited. She counted to 60 in her head, then counted to 60 again. When she was certain the corridor was silent, she pulled the curtain aside and stepped out. The room was dark. The only light came from the thin gap beneath the door and the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Rosalind's eyes adjusted slowly, and she looked around the study for Christopher. He was standing behind the open door, pressed flat against the wall in the narrow space between the door hinges and the corner. When the man had pushed the door open, the door itself had swung inward and concealed Christopher behind it, like a second wall. He had been standing there the entire time, invisible, with the forged document still inside his coat and his back against the plaster. He stepped away from the wall and let out a breath that sounded as though he had been holding it since the handle first turned. "Who was that?" Rosalind whispered. "I could not see his face from behind the door. One of Malachi's household, most likely. A secretary or a personal valet, someone with access to the study. He was searching the desk. I heard. Whatever he was looking for, he did not find it, and he did not check the safe. Christopher touched his coat, where the document was hidden, confirming it was still there. "We need to leave. Genevieve cannot keep Malachi occupied indefinitely, and if that man returns and notices anything out of place, we lose our advantage." Rosalind gathered her writing case from where she had left it by the door. She checked the room one final time. The painting was straight, the safe was closed, the desk drawers were shut, the carpet was undisturbed. Everything looked exactly as it had when she picked the lock 20 minutes ago, except that the air now carried fresh cigar smoke, which would actually support the impression that the last person in the room had been its rightful occupant. Christopher pressed his ear to the door and listened. After a long moment, he turned the handle and eased the door open a crack. The corridor was empty. The lanterns along the wall cast steady pools of light on the polished floor, and the distant hum of conversation and clinking glass drifted up from the ground floor. They slipped out together. Rosalind locked the study door behind them with her picks, which took less than 15 seconds this time. Christopher raised an eyebrow. "My grandfather was thorough in his teaching," she said quietly. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man, and I intend to ask you a great deal more about him when we are safely back at Oakhaven." They separated at the top of the staircase. Christopher descended the main stairs and re-entered the dining room through the front doors, pausing to accept a glass of wine from a passing footman as though he had simply stepped out for some air. Rosalind took the servants' staircase down to the ground floor and made her way back through the servants' hall, which was still churning with the activity of the meal service. She walked through the kitchen, past the scullery, and out the rear door into the cold night air. The forecourt was lit by carriage lanterns, and the coachmen were gathered in a loose circle near the stable block, sharing a flask and talking about horses. Rosalind found Genevieve's coachman among them, and told him quietly that she would be waiting in the carriage whenever the Duke's party was ready to depart. She climbed inside the blue coach, set the writing case on the seat beside her, and sat in the dark, with her hands folded in her lap. Her fingers were still tingling from the lockwork, and her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Through the carriage window, she could see the bright windows of Thorn Hall, the chandeliers, the moving shadows of guests, the warm golden light that spilled across the gravel like something inviting and safe. Inside that beautiful house, a man was hosting a dinner party for the sole purpose of protecting a lie he had built 15 years ago over his dead brother's grave. And somewhere inside his coat pocket, walking calmly through that man's own ballroom, Christopher Sterling was carrying the proof that would bring the entire lie crashing down. 40 minutes later, Christopher and Genevieve emerged from the front entrance. Genevieve was laughing at something, her hand resting lightly on Christopher's arm, playing the role of the contented fiancée with the skill of a woman who had spent her entire adult life performing for her uncle's benefit. Malachi stood in the doorway behind them, a tall figure in a dark evening coat, watching them leave with a smile that did not reach the corners of his mouth. They climbed into the carriage. The coachman flicked the reins, and the horses pulled them down the long gravel drive, past the ancient oaks, and out through the iron gates onto the dark Somerset Road. Nobody spoke until the lights of Thorn Hall had disappeared entirely behind the hills. Then Genevieve pulled off her gloves, tossed them onto the seat, and said, "Please tell me you found it." Christopher reached inside his coat and produced the folded document with the dark red wax seal. He held it up so that the moonlight coming through the carriage window caught the surface of the paper. "We found it," he said. Genevieve pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them back fiercely, refusing to let them fall. "That is my father's trust. The real terms, the ones my uncle rewrote. Combined with the original deed from Weymouth, this is everything the magistrate needs to void the amendment and release your inheritance." Genevieve lowered her hands and looked at Rosalind. "You did this. You got into that safe." "Your directions were very precise," Rosalind said. "The painting, the safe, the lock, You gave us everything we needed. I gave you a sketch on the back of a napkin. You walked into my uncle's private study during a dinner party and cracked his personal safe while he was drinking port 50 feet below. That is rather more than following directions. Genevieve reached across the carriage and took Rosalind's hand. Thank you. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that you have given me back something I thought I had lost permanently. The carriage rolled on through the dark countryside, and Rosalind sat with Genevieve's hand in hers and the distant stars visible through the window, and allowed herself, for the first time in many days, to believe that this might actually end well. The county magistrate's chambers in Dorchester occupied the upper floor of a handsome brick building on the high street, directly above a solicitor's office and across the lane from a tea merchant whose shop filled the entire street with the scent of Ceylon and Darjeeling. It was the kind of building that looked as though important decisions had been made inside it for a very long time, which was reassuring, because the decision being requested today was among the most important any of them had ever faced. Christopher had sent word ahead by private messenger 3 days earlier, requesting an urgent hearing on a matter of probate fraud. The magistrate, a man named Justice Alderton, had agreed to receive them at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 15th day, a Tuesday, which Rosalind noted because she had been counting the days since her attempted departure from the Dorset Cross coaching station, with the precision of someone marking time in a prison sentence. 15 days. It had taken 15 days to go from a woman with a carpet bag and a torn ticket to a woman sitting in a magistrate's waiting room with 2 documents that could reshape the futures of everyone she had come to care about. They arrived separately, as Christopher had insisted. He and Genevieve came in the Oakhaven carriage, dressed formally, looking every part the engaged Duke and his titled fiancée, conducting routine legal business. Rosalind came 30 minutes later, in a hired cab from the village, wearing her dark clerk's dress and carrying the leather writing case containing the original trust deed from the Weymouth Registry. Christopher carried the forged amendment from Malachi's safe inside a locked portfolio chained to his wrist. He had not let it out of his sight since the night at Thorn Hall, sleeping with it beneath his pillow and carrying it on his person during the day. Rosalind had told him he was being excessive. Christopher had replied that a man who had broken into another man's private safe during a dinner party had earned the right to be excessive about protecting what he found there. She could not argue with that. The waiting room was a narrow space with wooden benches along the walls and a single clerk's desk near the inner door. The clerk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and an anxious manner, who kept glancing at Christopher's title, as though it might bite him. He showed them through to Justice Alderton's chambers, with the hurried deference of someone who did not often receive dukes in his Tuesday morning appointments. Justice Alderton was not what Rosalind had expected. She had imagined a stern, elderly man in black robes with a powdered wig and an expression carved from granite. Instead, the magistrate was perhaps 50, with a broad, weathered face that suggested he spent more time walking his dogs than sitting behind a desk. His chambers were cluttered with papers, books, and a collection of small wooden bird carvings arranged along the windowsill. He wore a plain dark coat rather than formal robes, and he greeted them with a firm handshake and a direct gaze that told Rosalind he was not a man who appreciated wasted time. "Your Grace," he said, gesturing toward 3 chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Lady Genevieve. And this is Miss Rosalind Vance, my estate records clerk," Christopher said. "She located the original trust documents and can speak to their provenance." Alderton studied Rosalind for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Sit down, all of you, and show me what you have brought." Christopher unlocked the portfolio and laid both documents side by side on the magistrate's desk. The original trust deed from 1832, with its clear, unambiguous language granting Genevieve her inheritance at 25 without condition, and the forged amendment from 1834, filed 8 months after Lord Aldrich Thorne's death, adding the marriage clause that had controlled Genevieve's life for 15 years. Alderton read both documents in silence. He was a slow, methodical reader, and he went through each one twice before setting them down and removing his spectacles to polish them on his sleeve. A gesture that Rosalind suspected was less about cleaning the lenses and more about giving himself time to think. "Miss Vance," he said, replacing the spectacles, "where did you locate the original trust deed?" "In the Weymouth Town Registry Office, sir. It was filed in a wooden storage box labeled with the Thorne family name, in the East Archive Room, among records from 1832. The box also contained the amendment, which had been filed separately with a later date." "And you are confident that both documents were in their original condition when you found them? They had not been moved, altered, or tampered with?" "The wax seals on both documents were intact when I removed them from the box. The paper and ink on the original deed are consistent with documents from the early 1830s. The amendment uses slightly newer paper and a different ink, which is consistent with being written 2 years later." Alderton turned to Christopher. "And the second copy of the amendment, the one with Lord Malachi's personal seal, where did that come from?" Christopher met the magistrate's gaze steadily. "It was retrieved from Lord Malachi's private estate by Lady Genevieve, who had knowledge of its location within the household. It was a careful answer, and technically accurate. Genevieve had provided the information that led to the document's retrieval. The specifics of who had actually picked the lock on the study door, cracked the safe, and removed the document while its owner drank port in the ballroom below were details that Christopher had evidently decided the magistrate did not need." Alderton looked at Genevieve. "Lady Genevieve, you are the beneficiary named in this trust. Is it your testimony that your uncle, Lord Malachi Thorne, filed a fraudulent amendment to your father's will after your father's death?" Genevieve's voice was clear and unwavering. "It is, sir. My father died in June of 1833. The amendment adding the marriage clause is dated November 1834. My father could not have authorized or approved it. Furthermore, the handwriting on the amendment matches my uncle's hand, which I have seen on hundreds of personal letters and household documents throughout my life." Alderton made several notes on a sheet of paper, then sat back in his chair and studied the three of them with the measured attention of a man weighing evidence against instinct. "I have served as county magistrate for 12 years, he said. "In that time, I have seen a great number of probate disputes, most of which come down to ambiguous language or family disagreements about a deceased person's intentions. This is neither of those things. This is a clear case of a legal document being materially altered after the death of its author, by a person who stood to benefit directly from the alteration." He picked up the original trust deed and held it beside the amendment. The original deed contains no marriage condition. The amendment, filed posthumously, adds one. The handwriting on the amendment does not match the handwriting on the original. The executor who filed the amendment, Lord Malachi Thorne, has served as the sole controller of the trust for 15 years, during which time the beneficiary has been unable to access her own inheritance. Alderton set both documents down. "I am prepared to issue a ruling today. The amendment dated November 1834 is hereby declared fraudulent and void. The original trust deed of March 1832 shall stand as the sole governing document. Lady Genevieve Thorne is entitled to the full and immediate release of her inheritance, without condition, upon her 25th birthday or upon application to the Weymouth County Bank, whichever comes first." Genevieve's hands tightened in her lap. She said nothing, but Rosalind saw the muscles in her jaw working as she fought to maintain her composure. Alderton continued, Furthermore, as the conditions that necessitated the engagement contract between His Grace the Duke of Oakhaven and Lady Genevieve Thorne are now removed, that contract is subject to dissolution by mutual agreement of both parties. Do you both consent to the dissolution? I do, Christopher said. I do, Genevieve said, and her voice broke slightly on the second word, a tiny crack in the steady surface she had maintained throughout the entire proceeding. Alderton signed 3 copies of the ruling, stamped each one with the county seal, and handed one to Christopher, one to Genevieve, and retained one for the court records. I will also be forwarding a recommendation to the Crown Prosecutor's Office regarding the conduct of Lord Malachi Thorne. The alteration of a probate document is a serious offense, and I expect there will be further proceedings. He stood and extended his hand to each of them in turn. When he reached Rosalind, he paused. Miss Vance, your eye for documents has been rather instrumental today. If you ever tire of estate work, the registry service could use someone with your particular talents. Rosalind shook his hand. Thank you, sir. I believe I am spoken for at present. They left the chambers and descended the staircase to the high street. The morning sun was warm on the brick facades, and the tea merchant's shop was sending clouds of fragrant steam into the air through an open window. Dorchester was going about its ordinary Tuesday business, shopkeepers sweeping their steps, a milkmaid driving her cart toward the market square, 2 boys chasing a hoop along the pavement, and none of them knew that the 3 people standing on the magistrate's steps had just dismantled a 15-year fraud with 2 pieces of yellowed paper and the truth. Genevieve turned to Christopher and held out her hand. He took it, and they shook once, firmly, with the mutual respect of 2 people who had survived something difficult together and were now free to walk away from each other without regret. Thank you, Christopher, she said, for everything. Write to your lieutenant, Christopher replied. He has waited long enough. Genevieve smiled, the first truly unburdened smile Rosalind had seen from her, and walked to her waiting carriage without looking back. Christopher and Rosalind stood on the steps together, watching the blue coach pull away down the high street. When it had turned the corner and disappeared, Christopher looked at Rosalind. It is done, he said. It is done, she agreed. He offered her his arm. She took it, and they walked together down the sunlit street, toward the Oakhaven carriage, 2 people who finally had nothing left standing between them. 3 days passed before Christopher called the household together. Rosalind spent those 3 days in a strange kind of suspension, like the held breath between a lightning flash and the thunder that follows. She continued her work in the North Wing Library, sorting estate records that no longer needed sorting, because the habit of usefulness was difficult to break, and because sitting still made her restless in a way she could not explain. Christopher was occupied with his solicitor, a gray-haired man named Mr. Fellows, who arrived from London on the afternoon coach and spent 2 full days closeted in the estate office, reviewing the magistrate's ruling, drafting correspondence to creditors, and restructuring the debt repayment schedule that would now proceed under entirely different terms. Rosalind saw Christopher only at meals, where he sat at the head of the long dining table, looking tired, but lighter, as though someone had removed a physical weight from across his shoulders. On the evening of the second day, he found her in the library. She was standing at the window, watching the last of the daylight fade across the south garden. The roses were beginning to bloom in earnest now, and the air coming through the open casement smelled of warm earth and cut grass and something sweet that might have been honeysuckle growing along the garden wall. Christopher closed the door behind him and stood in the center of the room. He was wearing a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his cravat was loosened, and he looked more like a farmer at the end of a long day than a duke standing in his own library. Rosalind found she preferred him this way. Mr. Fellows has confirmed that the debts can be settled within 6 months, he said. Genevieve's trust has been released by the Weymouth County Bank, and her contribution to the estate has been transferred as agreed. The most urgent creditors have already been notified, and the mortgage on the north farmland will be cleared by autumn. That is good news. It is the best news this house has received in a decade. He paused. There is also a letter from Genevieve. She has written to Lieutenant Hale, and he has applied for shore leave. She expects to be married by midsummer. Rosalind smiled. She deserves that. She does. Christopher took a step closer. There is one more piece of business I need to discuss with you. If it involves another forged will or a locked safe, I would appreciate some advance warning this time. He laughed. A real, full laugh that filled the room and startled a wood pigeon from the windowsill outside. Rosalind realized she had never heard him laugh like that. In 11 months at Oakhaven, she had seen him smile perhaps a dozen times, always briefly, always carefully, as though joy were something rationed and he was afraid of using his portion too quickly. No safes, he said. No forged documents. Something rather simpler, though I confess I have been rehearsing it in my head for the past 2 days, and it has not become any easier. He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and withdrew a small velvet pouch, the kind used by jewelers for rings and brooches. It was old, the velvet worn smooth in places, and the drawstring was frayed. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment before meeting her eyes. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "My father gave it to her on the morning they were married, in the chapel at the end of the East Garden. She wore it every day of her life until the fever took her, and after she died, my father kept it in his bedside drawer. When he died, it came to me, and I have been carrying it in that drawer ever since, waiting for the day when I could give it to the person it was meant for." He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his hand. A ring, gold, slender, set with a single small garnet in an oval setting. It was not a grand ring. It was not the kind of jewelry that wealthy families displayed in glass cases or insured with London underwriters. It was a modest, beautiful, well-loved thing that had clearly been worn every day for years, because the band was smooth with use and the setting had the particular warmth that metal acquires when it has been close to living skin for a long time. Rosalind looked at the ring and then at Christopher, and she felt the room around her grow very quiet, as though the house itself were listening. "I am going to gather the household tomorrow morning," Christopher said. "I am going to announce the dissolution of my engagement to Lady Genevieve, and I am going to tell them the truth, that the engagement was a legal arrangement, that it has been resolved, and that Oakhaven is secure. And then I am going to tell them that I intend to marry the woman who saved this estate, who cracked a safe in a stranger's house during a dinner party, who was brave enough to stay when every reasonable instinct told her to leave, and who has shown me more courage and more loyalty and more grace in 15 days than I have encountered in 28 years of living among the finest families in England." Rosalind felt the tears come before she could stop them. They ran down her cheeks in warm, silent lines, and she did not wipe them away because her hands were shaking, and she was afraid that if she moved at all, she might discover that this was a dream, and the morning bell would ring, and she would wake up in her narrow attic bed with the cracked mirror and the cold draft from the dormer window. Christopher stepped forward and placed the ring in her palm. He closed her fingers around it gently. "I am not asking you to be my maid, Rosalind. I am not asking you to be my clerk, or my accomplice, or my co-conspirator in breaking into country estates. I am asking you to be my wife, to stand beside me in this house as the Duchess of Oakhaven, as my equal and my partner in everything that comes after this." Rosalind opened her hand and looked at the ring. The garnet caught the last of the evening light, and glowed like a small, steady ember. "You could have any woman in England," she said, "any titled lady, any heiress, any daughter of any noble family in the country. You know what people will say about a duke who marries his housemaid. I know exactly what they will say. And I know that not one of those titled ladies or heiresses or noble daughters would have torn up a letter to Cornwall, ridden to Weymouth in borrowed spectacles, picked a lock in 40 seconds, or stood behind a velvet curtain in a stranger's study, holding her breath, while a man smoked a cigar 3 feet away." He paused. "I do not want any woman in England, Rosalind. I want the woman standing in front of me." She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her hand all along. "Then you have her," she said. The next morning, the household assembled in the great hall at 9 o'clock. Every footman, kitchen maid, groom, gardener, and scullery girl stood in the same rows where they had stood 18 days earlier, listening to their duke announce his engagement to a woman none of them knew. This time, Christopher stood at the head of the long table in his shirt sleeves, with no prepared speech and no formal tone. He told them simply that the engagement to Lady Genevieve had been dissolved by mutual agreement, that the estate's financial difficulties were being resolved, and that their positions and their families' tenancies were secure. Then he asked Rosalind to step forward. She walked from the back of the hall to stand beside him, wearing her plain gray dress and her worn boots, and the gold ring with the garnet that caught the light from the tall windows. The room was utterly silent. "Miss Vance has agreed to become my wife," Christopher said, "and I consider myself the most fortunate man in Dorset." Mrs. Pemberton was the first to react. The housekeeper, who had supervised Rosalind's work for 11 months and had never once shown emotion more expressive than a raised eyebrow, pressed her handkerchief to her eyes and said, "Well, it is about time, Your Grace." The hall erupted. Later, when the cheering and the hand-shaking and the tearful congratulations had subsided, Christopher led Rosalind through the garden doors to the estate conservatory. It was warm inside, filled with the green scent of ferns and the soft trickle of water from a small stone fountain in the corner. Sunlight poured through the glass ceiling and fell in bright squares across the flagstone floor. They stood together among the ferns and the climbing jasmine, and Christopher took her hand, the one wearing his mother's ring, and held it. "15 days ago, you tried to leave on a stagecoach," he said. "15 days ago, you bought every seat on that stagecoach to stop me. I would do it again." Rosalind looked at the ring on her finger, then at the garden beyond the glass, then at the man standing beside her, who had once been her employer and was now something far more permanent. "You will not have to," she said. Outside, the grounds of Oakhaven Manor stretched green and whole under the spring sky, and somewhere in the distance, the village church bells began to ring.